The rusted iron gate groaned against Emma Ashworth's trembling fingers as she forced the ancient key into the lock that hadn't turned in 30 years. October wind whipped through her dark hair, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something that made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Behind her, gravel crunched under her mother's hesitant footsteps. "Emma, we don't have to do this today," Sarah Ashworth whispered, her voice barely audible above the October wind. "Your grandmother's been dead for 24 hours. The will reading was this morning. We could wait, let the lawyers handle." "No." Emma's voice cut through the air with surprising firmness. At 15 years and 11 months old, she had inherited more than just her grandmother's sharp jawline and piercing green eyes. She had inherited questions that had festered in her family for generations, and today felt like the first time she might find answers. "I need to see what she left me." The key finally clicked, and the gate swung open with a screech that seemed to echo from the manor's broken windows. Ashworth Manor loomed before them like a monument of forgotten nightmares, its Victorian Gothic architecture twisted into something that looked more like a mausoleum than a home. Paint peeled from weathered shutters, and ivy crawled across the facade like reaching fingers, choking the life from carved stone angels that guarded the entrance. Emma stepped onto the cobblestone path, and her breath caught in her throat. Rose bushes lined the walkway, their stems bare and thorny, their blooms long since withered into black, papery husks that rustled with each gust of wind. She had expected abandonment and decay, but this felt different, intentional, as though the manor had been waiting for her arrival. "Emma, stop." Sarah's hand clamped down on her daughter's shoulder with desperate force. "There are things about this family, about this place, that you don't understand. Things your grandmother swore me to secrecy about until," her voice broke, and Emma turned to see tears streaming down her mother's pale cheeks. "Until what, Mom?" "Until your 16th birthday." Emma pulled away from her mother's grip and continued toward the manor's front door, another key heavy in her palm. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks until she turned 16, and already her world felt like it was cracking at the edges. Her grandmother's funeral had been a small affair, no extended family, no childhood friends, just Emma, her mother, and a handful of elderly neighbors who whispered about the Ashworth family's tragic history, when they thought no one was listening. The front door opened before Emma could fit the key into the lock, as though the house itself was eager to welcome her inside. The hinges screamed in protest, and stale air rushed out to meet them, air that tasted of dust, mildew, and something metallic that made Emma's tongue curl in revulsion. Inside, afternoon light filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows across a grand entrance hall that might once have been beautiful. Now it felt like stepping into a tomb. Dust particles danced in the pale sunbeams, and Emma's footsteps echoed against hardwood floors that groaned under her weight. But it was the portraits that stopped her cold. They lined the walls of the entrance hall and continued up the grand staircase, dozens of oil paintings in ornate golden frames, each depicting a young woman with the unmistakable Ashworth features. High cheekbones, full lips, those piercing green eyes that Emma saw in her own mirror every morning. But there was something wrong with the collection, something that made her skin crawl with recognition she couldn't name. "They're all the same age," Emma whispered, moving closer to examine the nearest portrait. The nameplate read, "Catherine Ashworth, 1851 to 1867, and the girl in the painting couldn't have been older than 16. Sarah stepped up beside her daughter, her face white with something that looked like terror. "Emma, we need to leave. Right now." But Emma was already moving deeper into the gallery, studying each portrait with growing horror. Elizabeth Ashworth, 1823 to 1839. Victoria Ashworth, 1889 to 1905. Mary Ashworth, 1923 to 1939. Every nameplate told the same impossible story, young women who had lived exactly 16 years, no more, no less. At the far end of the gallery, Emma found the portrait that made her blood freeze in her veins. The golden frame was cracked, and dark stains had seeped across the canvas in patterns that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The nameplate read, Margaret Ashworth, 1941 to 1957, and the girl in the painting was a mirror image of Emma herself, the same dark hair, the same defiant expression, the same eyes that seemed to follow viewers as they moved. Aunt Margaret, Emma breathed. Her mother had rarely spoken of her younger sister, only mentioning that Margaret had died young in some kind of accident. But the girl in the portrait didn't look like someone who had died accidentally. She looked like someone who had been waiting for something, someone who had known exactly what was coming for her. Sarah moved past Emma to the portrait, her hands shaking as she reached behind the frame. Your grandmother said there would be something here, something I was supposed to give you when the time came. Her fingers found a hidden envelope, yellowed with age and addressed in spidery handwriting, for the next Ashworth daughter. Emma's name wasn't on the envelope, but somehow she knew it was meant for her. She could feel it calling to her, the same way the manor itself had seemed to beckon from beyond the rusted gate. Don't open it, Sarah whispered, but her protest was weak, defeated. They both knew that Emma was going to read whatever was inside, just as they both knew that coming to the manor had been inevitable from the moment the lawyer had read her grandmother's will. Emma tore open the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in the same spidery handwriting. The words seemed to writhe on the page as she read them aloud, her voice growing stronger with each terrible revelation. My dear Emma, the letter began, if you are reading this, then your 16th birthday approaches, and the time has come for you to understand what it means to be an Ashworth daughter. Every daughter pays the price. Every daughter keeps the pact. Your time approaches, Emma. The family debt cannot be escaped. Emma's hands shook as she continued reading, her voice barely a whisper now. Look to the portraits, child. See what awaits all Ashworth daughters. We have prospered for generations, but prosperity demands payment. The agreement was made long ago, before your grandmother's grandmother was born, and it cannot be broken by death or distance. When your 16th birthday arrives, you will understand. When midnight strikes on that day, you will join your sisters in the gallery, and your daughter will read these same words in her time. The letter fell from Emma's nerveless fingers, drifting to the dusty floor like a death sentence. Around them, the portraits seemed to shimmer in the fading afternoon light, and Emma could swear she heard whispers echoing from their painted lips, warnings, or perhaps welcomes, she couldn't tell which. Sarah gathered the letter with shaking hands, her eyes wild with a fear that Emma was only beginning to understand. We're leaving, she said, grabbing Emma's arm. Right now. We're going home, and we're never coming back here. But even as they fled the manor, Emma knew it was too late. She could feel something following them, something that had been waiting in those painted eyes for 30 years. The Ashworth family debt, whatever it was, had found its next victim. As they reached the rusted gate, Emma looked back at the manor one last time. In the upstairs window, she could swear she saw a figure watching, young, female, with dark hair and green eyes that looked exactly like her own. 21 days until her 16th birthday. The countdown had begun. Have you ever inherited something that felt more like a curse than a gift? What would you do if your family's darkest secret was waiting for you in an abandoned house? Emma couldn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those portraits staring down at her, their painted faces shifting in the candlelight of her dreams. By the fourth morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her mother's worried glances had become constant surveillance. You're not going back there, Sarah said over breakfast, her coffee cup rattling against the saucer as she set it down. I don't care what that letter said, I don't care what your grandmother's will stipulated. That place is poison, Emma. It killed my sister, and it's not going to kill my daughter. But Emma was already pulling on her jacket, car keys jingling in her pocket. I borrowed Janet's car. I'll be back before dinner. Emma, please." Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. "There are things about our family, about that manor, that you can't possibly understand. Things that go back generations." "Then explain them to me," Emma shot back, whirling to face her mother. "Stop treating me like a child who can't handle the truth. In 17 days, I turn 16. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen whether I understand it or not." Sarah's face went pale, and for a moment Emma thought her mother might finally tell her everything. Instead, Sarah just shook her head and whispered, "Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud." The drive to Ashworth Manor felt different in daylight. The October sun cast everything in golden hues that should have been beautiful, but somehow the light only made the approaching estate look more ominous. Emma parked outside the rusted gate and walked up the cobblestone path alone, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Inside the manor, dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams, and the portrait gallery stretched before her like a museum of the dead. But today, Emma wasn't content to simply look. Today, she needed answers. She started with the oldest portrait, studying Elizabeth Ashworth's face with forensic intensity. The girl in the painting was beautiful in that ethereal way that suggested she had never known hardship or fear. Her dress was clearly from the 1830s, and the background showed rolling hills that Emma recognized as the view from the manor's east wing. But there was something in Elizabeth's painted eyes that didn't match her serene expression, a knowledge that seemed too old for her 16-year-old face. Moving systematically through the gallery, Emma began to notice patterns. Each portrait showed subtle signs of the era it was painted in, clothing styles, background details, even the painting techniques evolved with the decades. But the girls themselves remained hauntingly similar. Not just in their Ashworth features, but in that same knowing look, that same mixture of resignation and defiance. It was while studying Victoria Ashworth's 1905 portrait that Emma accidentally brushed against the frame and heard a soft click. The painting swung inward like a door, revealing a hidden passage behind the wall. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered into the darkness beyond. Cool air drifted out of the passage, carrying scents of old paper and something else, something that reminded her of the way flowers smelled just before they rotted completely. She found a flashlight in the manor's kitchen and returned to investigate. The passage led to a small, windowless room that had clearly been used as a study or library. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and stacks of loose papers. A writing desk sat in the center, its surface covered with what looked like decades' worth of correspondence. Emma approached the desk with trembling hands. The papers were covered in different handwriting, some in careful script, others in desperate scrawls that suggested they had been written in terrible haste. But they all began the same way: "I am, name, Ashworth, and my 16th birthday approaches." She lifted the first document, dated 1889. "I am Victoria Ashworth, and my 16th birthday approaches. The dreams have begun again, just as Mother warned me they would. Every night, I see him waiting beneath the old oak tree in the cemetery. He calls my name, and I feel myself being drawn toward him like iron to a magnet. Mother says it has always been this way for Ashworth daughters. She says the pact was made long before any of us were born, and that fighting it only makes the ending more painful." Emma's hands shook as she reached for the next document, this one dated 1923. Mary Ashworth had written, "The thing in my dreams is not a man, though it wears the shape of one. It is something older, something that feeds on what we are and what we might have been. It promised my great-great-grandmother wealth and power for the Ashworth name, and she was desperate enough to believe it. Now every daughter pays for her desperation with our lives." Document after document told variations of the same story. Ashworth daughters who had tried to run, only to find themselves drawn back to the manor by forces they couldn't resist. Daughters who had attempted to break the pattern through marriage or travel, only to discover that the entity that held their family's contract could reach them anywhere. Daughters who had fought against their fate until the very end, and daughters who had accepted it with quiet dignity. But it was the final document that made Emma's blood turn to ice. The handwriting was bold and defiant, and the date was October 15, 1957, just 16 days before Margaret Ashworth's death. I am Margaret Ashworth, and I refuse to accept what previous generations have called inevitable. The entity that holds our family's soul is not invincible. I have found references in the oldest grimoires, hints that the pact can be broken if the right price is paid. But it requires sacrifice from someone who has already passed their 16th year, someone with Ashworth blood who is willing to take the place of the intended victim. Mother is too frightened to help me, but I believe there is a way to end this cycle forever. The entry continued, I have discovered the truth about our family's prosperity. Every business venture that succeeded, every political connection that opened doors for us, every stroke of luck that elevated the Ashworth name, all of it was purchased with the lives of 16-year-old girls. We are not blessed. We are cursed, and our curse has made us wealthy beyond measure. But wealth built on such a foundation is nothing more than blood money, and I would rather die poor than live knowing my future daughter will face the same fate I face now. Emma turned the page and found Margaret's final entry, dated October 30, 1957. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Tomorrow is my 16th birthday, and I can feel it calling to me. The thing that dwells beneath the oak tree, the thing that has claimed so many Ashworth daughters, grows stronger as midnight approaches. I tried to perform the ritual I found in the old books, but something went wrong. The entity is angry, and its fury has awakened something else, something that has been sleeping in the foundations of this manor. If anyone reads this, know that I tried to break the chain. Know that I fought until the end. And know that the next Ashworth daughter, Emma, if my calculations are correct, will face not just the original entity, but the darkness I accidentally unleashed in my attempts to destroy it. Emma staggered back from the desk, Margaret's journal entries scattered at her feet. 16 days. She had 16 days before whatever had killed her aunt came for her. But now she understood that it wasn't just one entity she would face, it was the original creature that held their family's pact, plus whatever Margaret's failed ritual had awakened. As she gathered the papers with shaking hands, Emma became aware of a sound that made her skin crawl. Somewhere in the manor, a clock was chiming midnight, even though her watch showed it was only 3 in the afternoon. The chimes echoed through the empty halls, and with each tolling note, Emma could swear she heard whispers, the voices of dead Ashworth daughters calling her name. She fled the hidden room and ran through the portrait gallery, but as she passed each painting, she noticed something that stopped her cold. The eyes in every portrait were now looking directly at her, and their painted lips were moving, forming words she couldn't quite hear but somehow understood. Your turn. Your turn. Your turn. Emma burst through the manor's front door and didn't stop running until she reached her car. But even as she drove away, she could see the manor in her rearview mirror, and every window now glowed with an unnatural light that pulsed in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. That night, the dreams began. Emma's eyes snapped open to absolute darkness. Her bedroom clock showed 3:17 a.m., but something felt wrong, the silence was too complete, too deliberate. Even the usual sounds of the house settling were absent, as though the entire world had been muffled by some invisible force. She sat up in bed, and her bare feet hit the floor without her conscious decision to move. The hardwood was ice-cold against her skin, and she realized she was wearing only her nightgown, a thin cotton shift that offered no protection against the October chill that seemed to be seeping through the walls. Emma tried to turn on her bedside lamp, but her hand moved past the switch as though it had a will of its own. Her legs carried her toward her bedroom door, and she watched in growing horror as her body moved independently of her mind. She was a passenger in her own flesh, helpless to stop whatever force was compelling her forward. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel, and her bare feet made no sound as she descended the stairs. The front door stood open, though she was certain her mother had locked it before bed. Cool night air rushed in to meet her, and Emma caught the scent of dead roses and something else, earth, recently turned, as though graves had been dug somewhere nearby. She walked through the suburban streets of her neighborhood like a sleepwalker, her nightgown billowing around her ankles. Street lamps flickered as she passed beneath them, and she could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Other houses remained dark and silent, their windows like blind eyes that offered no hope of rescue or intervention. The path to Ashworth Cemetery was one Emma knew well from childhood visits to her grandfather's grave, but tonight it felt different. Ancient oak trees lined the road, their branches reaching across the asphalt to form a tunnel of gnarled wood that blocked out the moon and stars. With each step, Emma felt her own will slipping further away, replaced by something older and infinitely more patient. The cemetery gates stood open, though Emma was certain they were usually chained shut at night. As she stepped onto the gravel path that wound between weathered headstones, she could hear whispering voices carried on the wind, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. At the heart of the cemetery stood an oak tree that was older than the town itself, its massive trunk scarred by lightning strikes and time. Its roots had pushed up through the earth, creating a natural amphitheater among the graves, and Emma could see that every headstone in the immediate area bore the name Ashworth. But it was the freshly dug grave that made her blood freeze. The headstone was already in place, carved from black marble that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the moonlight. The inscription was clear and terrible: Emma Sarah Ashworth, 1971 to 1987. You're early. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating from the oak tree's ancient wood and rising from the disturbed earth of her own grave. Emma turned toward the sound and saw a figure emerge from the shadows beneath the tree, tall and gaunt, dressed in clothing that might have been fashionable in the 18th century but now hung from his skeletal frame like funeral shrouds. He was not human, had never been human, though he wore humanity like an ill-fitting mask. His eyes were holes in reality that showed glimpses of star-filled voids, and when he smiled, his teeth were too numerous and sharp as broken glass. The air around him shimmered with heat distortion, as though the very presence of this creature was burning away the fabric of the world. Emma Ashworth, he said, and her name sounded like a death sentence in his voice. The last of your bloodline, unless you choose to continue the family tradition of early motherhood. Your ancestor Elizabeth was quite clever in that regard, ensuring the pact would continue even if individual daughters proved reluctant. Emma tried to speak, tried to move, tried to scream, but her body remained frozen in place. Only her mind was her own, and that was filled with questions that tumbled over each other in desperate succession. The entity circled her like a predator studying prey, his footsteps leaving scorch marks in the grass. You have questions, child. That's natural. Your predecessors always had questions in those final moments. Allow me to satisfy your curiosity, as it will make no difference in the end. He gestured toward the Ashworth graves that surrounded them. Your bloodline has flourished for 224 years because of our agreement. Every business venture that succeeded, every political connection that opened doors, every stroke of luck that elevated your family's name, all purchased with the lives of 16-year-old girls. The Ashworth family tree is watered with blood, and it has grown magnificent as a result. Emma's eyes filled with tears that she couldn't wipe away. The entity noticed and laughed, a sound like breaking bones. Oh, you disapprove? How refreshingly naive. Your family built their fortune on my generosity, child. Your prestigious schools, your beautiful homes, your social connections, the trust funds that ensure no Ashworth ever wants for anything, where did you think such prosperity came from? Your ancestors were farmers and servants before Elizabeth made our bargain. Now your family name opens doors that remain closed to others. That is the gift I have given you. The creature moved closer, and Emma could feel heat radiating from his form like standing too close to a furnace. But gifts require payment, and payment comes due. Every generation must offer up its tribute, one daughter, in the bloom of her youth, when her potential is greatest and her essence most valuable. Your death will purchase another generation of prosperity for any children you might have had, just as your Aunt Margaret's death secured your mother's fortune, and your mother's older sister's death secured Margaret's comfort. Emma's mind reeled. Her mother had an older sister. Someone who had died before Margaret, someone whose death had never been mentioned in family histories. The entity smiled, reading her confusion. Oh yes, child. Sarah was not supposed to be the survivor. Helen was the chosen daughter, born in 1940, meant to die in 1956. But Helen proved resourceful. She found a way to redirect the pact to her younger sister instead. Margaret died so that Sarah could live, just as you will die so that any future Ashworth children can prosper. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Her mother had known. Had always known. Had let Margaret die in her place and never spoken of it, never mourned the sister who had been sacrificed for her survival. The look in your eyes, the entity purred. That beautiful mixture of betrayal and understanding. It's the same expression Margaret wore when she realized that her own mother had manipulated the timing of her birth to ensure she, rather than Sarah, would be the sacrifice. Family bonds are so fragile when survival is at stake. Emma felt her body beginning to move again, but not under her own control. Her feet carried her toward the freshly dug grave, and she could see a stone altar at the bottom of the 6-foot pit, ancient granite carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The ritual is quite simple, the entity explained, following her progress with obvious satisfaction. A few words in the old tongue, a willing surrender of breath and blood, and your family's fortune is secured for another generation. Your suffering will be brief, but your essence will nourish the pact for decades to come. As Emma reached the edge of her own grave, she felt the compulsion wavering for just a moment, a brief window where her will was her own again. She used that moment to speak, her voice barely a whisper but filled with desperate defiance. What if I refuse? What if I break the pattern? The entity's smile widened, showing more of those two sharp teeth. Oh, my dear child. You cannot refuse. The pact is written in blood and bound by forces older than civilization. But if you could somehow resist, if you could somehow break free of the obligations your bloodline accepted, then every gift I have given your family would be reclaimed with interest. The Ashworth fortune would vanish overnight. The properties, the investments, the social connections, all of it would crumble to dust. Your family would be left with nothing but their name, and that name would be cursed instead of blessed. Emma's feet touched the first rung of the wooden ladder that led down into the grave, and she felt her control slipping away again. But this time, something else was fighting for possession of her body, a presence that felt familiar, protective, desperate. For just a moment, Emma heard another voice whispering in her ear, a voice she recognized from childhood lullabies and bedtime stories. Fight, Emma, Margaret's ghost urged. I tried to break the chain and failed, but I weakened it. You can finish what I started. But the price will be everything. As Emma descended into her own grave, she realized that the entity wasn't the only supernatural force in the cemetery tonight. The Ashworth daughters who had died before her were watching from their headstones, their spirits trapped in the same pact that had claimed their lives. And they were all waiting to see if Emma would be the one to finally set them free. The stone altar waited at the bottom of the grave, its surface stained with the blood of generations. But carved into its base, almost hidden by centuries of dark residue, Emma could see symbols that were different from the others, symbols that Margaret had carved during her failed attempt to break the pact. 15 days until her 16th birthday. The countdown continued, but now Emma knew she wasn't facing it alone. Emma woke in her own bed as dawn light filtered through her bedroom curtains, her nightgown damp with dew and her bare feet dirty with cemetery soil. For a moment she wondered if the midnight encounter had been another nightmare, but the grass stains on her ankles and the scent of turned earth clinging to her hair confirmed the terrible truth. Her mother sat in a chair beside her bed, fully dressed despite the early hour, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed, and Emma realized her mother had been crying. "How long have you known?" Emma asked, her voice hoarse from the cold night air she had breathed in the cemetery. Sarah's composure crumbled entirely. "Since I was 16. Since Helen died in my place. Since I became the first Ashworth daughter in 2 centuries to live past her appointed time." Emma sat up in bed, studying her mother's face with new understanding. "Tell me everything. No more secrets, no more protecting me from the truth. In 15 days I'm supposed to die, and I deserve to know why." Sarah moved to the window, staring out at their manicured suburban lawn as though she could see through the present moment to the generations of tragedy that had led them here. "The pact was made in 1763 by our ancestor Elizabeth Ashworth. She was 17, unwed, and pregnant, cast out by her family and facing starvation in the streets of Boston. The entity found her in her darkest moment and offered her a bargain." Emma pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as though she could protect herself from what was coming. The creature promised Elizabeth wealth, status, and security for her bloodline in exchange for a simple tribute: every generation would offer up one daughter at the age of 16. Elizabeth was desperate enough to accept, thinking she was only sacrificing herself. But the entity was cleverer than she realized. It waited until after her daughter was born before collecting its first payment. Sarah turned from the window, and Emma could see decades of guilt written in every line of her mother's face. "For 224 years, our family has prospered beyond any reasonable expectation. Every business venture succeeds, every investment pays dividends, every door opens for the Ashworth name. We live in beautiful homes, attend the finest schools, marry into influential families. All of it purchased with the lives of 16-year-old girls." Emma felt sick as the full scope of their family's wealth began to make sense. The trust funds that ensured financial security, the political connections that had smoothed their way through life, the social status that opened doors others couldn't even see, all of it built on a foundation of murdered children. "The lawyer who read grandmother's will," Emma said slowly. "He mentioned properties in 7 states, investment portfolios worth millions, business partnerships going back generations. How much are we worth, Mom? How much is my life worth to maintain all of this?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. $47 million in liquid assets. Properties valued at over $100 million more. The Ashworth family name is worth approximately $200 million, Emma. Your death will purchase another generation of that prosperity. Emma staggered out of bed and walked to her dresser, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The girl looking back at her had attended private schools without ever questioning how her family could afford the tuition. Had worn designer clothes without wondering why money was never an object. Had assumed that privilege was simply her birthright, never thinking to ask what had purchased such comfort. Helen was supposed to die in 1956, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally released secrets she had carried for 31 years. She was born in 1940, the designated daughter of her generation. But Helen was brilliant, resourceful, and she discovered the family's history when she found Margaret's research hidden in the manor. She spent her 16th year searching for a way to break the pact, and she found one. Emma turned from the mirror. What did she do? She manipulated the timing of my birth. The entity's contract specifies one daughter per generation, but it doesn't specify which daughter. Helen convinced our mother to have another child quickly, then used a ritual she found in one of Margaret's grimoires to redirect the pact's focus from herself to me. She was 17 and safe by the time I was born. The betrayal in Sarah's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. My own sister condemned me to death before I could even walk. But then, when my 16th birthday approached, I discovered what Helen had done. I found her research, her journals documenting how she had manipulated our mother's pregnancy to ensure her own survival. So I did what any desperate person would do, I found a way to pass the curse to someone else. Emma's blood turned to ice. Margaret. Margaret was born 11 months after me, a late and difficult pregnancy that nearly killed our mother. When I turned 16 and felt the entity's call beginning, I used Helen's own research to redirect the pact once more. Margaret died in 1957 so that I could live to see 1958. Emma stared at her mother in horror. 3 sisters, 2 betrayals, 1 survivor. The Ashworth family tree was watered with more than just blood, it was nourished by selfishness and the willingness to sacrifice family members for personal survival. But Margaret fought back, Emma said, remembering the desperate journal entries she had found in the manor's hidden room. She tried to break the pact entirely. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Margaret's attempt to destroy the entity backfired catastrophically. Instead of breaking the contract, she split it into 2 parts. The original entity still exists, still holds power over our family's fate. But she also awakened something else, something that had been sleeping in the foundations of Ashworth Manor for centuries. Now the pact requires not just your death, but your death under specific circumstances that will feed both creatures. Emma felt the room spinning around her. 2 entities. 2 sources of supernatural hunger that needed to be satisfied. No wonder Helen and Sarah's attempts to redirect the pact had only delayed the inevitable, they hadn't been fighting 1 enemy, but 2. What kind of specific circumstances? Emma asked, though she dreaded the answer. Sarah pulled a leather-bound journal from her purse, its pages filled with her own handwriting. I've spent 30 years researching what Margaret unleashed. The original entity feeds on youth and potential, the life force of someone who still has decades ahead of them. But the second creature, the thing Margaret accidentally awakened, feeds on despair and betrayal. It requires the death of someone who understands exactly what they're losing and why. Emma understood with crystalline clarity. The midnight summons hadn't just been about leading her to her own grave, it had been about showing her the full scope of her family's guilt, ensuring that when she died, she would die knowing that her entire life had been built on the corpses of her predecessors. The entity told me that refusing would destroy our family's fortune, Emma said. That everything we own would crumble to dust if the pact was broken. Sarah's laugh was bitter and sharp. That's true. Every penny, every property, every connection, all of it would vanish overnight. We would be left with nothing but our name, and that name would carry a curse instead of a blessing. But Emma, there's something else you need to understand. Sarah opened the journal and showed Emma pages of financial documents, family trees, and historical records. I've traced our bloodline's impact over the past 2 centuries. The wealth generated by our family's supernatural contract hasn't just benefited the Ashworth name. We've invested in companies that became major corporations, funded political campaigns that changed the course of history, and influenced social movements that shaped American culture. Our blood money has touched millions of lives. Emma stared at the documents, recognizing names and companies that she had grown up thinking were simply successful businesses. How many people would be affected if the Ashworth fortune disappeared? Tens of thousands of employees who depend on companies we funded. Dozens of charities that rely on Ashworth family donations. Political candidates whose careers we launched, judges whose elections we influenced, journalists whose publications we supported. Emma, breaking this pact wouldn't just destroy our family, it would send shockwaves through the entire social and economic structure of New England. The weight of responsibility settled on Emma's shoulders like a lead blanket. Her choice wasn't just between life and death, it was between personal survival and the collapse of systems that supported thousands of other lives. But there's one more thing, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. One more secret that I've never told anyone, not even your father. Emma braced herself for another revelation. The pact doesn't end with you, Emma. You're not the last Ashworth daughter. You have a half-sister. The journal fell from Emma's nerveless fingers, its pages scattering across the bedroom floor. What? Your father had an affair 15 years ago. The woman gave birth to a daughter, Rebecca, who carries Ashworth blood even though she doesn't know it. If you die as planned, Rebecca will face the same choice when she turns 16. But if you break the pact and survive, the curse will find her anyway. The entity will collect its payment from whatever Ashworth daughter it can claim. Emma understood the final, crushing truth. There was no escape for the Ashworth bloodline, no way to break the cycle without condemning another innocent girl to the same fate. Every solution led to someone's death, either Emma's own, or that of a half-sister who didn't even know she existed. Where is she? Emma whispered. Portland, Maine. Living with her mother under the name Rebecca Collins. She's 1 year old, Emma. Just a baby who doesn't know that her father's blood has marked her for death. Emma sank to her bedroom floor, surrounded by scattered journal pages that documented 2 centuries of family guilt. The morning sun streaming through her window felt like mockery, bright and warm while her world collapsed into impossible choices and inherited sins. There has to be another way, Emma said, though her voice lacked conviction. Margaret tried to break the pact and failed, but maybe she was missing something. Maybe there's a solution that doesn't require someone to die. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, gathering the journal pages with shaking hands. I've spent 30 years looking for that solution, Emma. I've consulted with occultists, historians, demonologists, anyone who might understand the forces we're dealing with. The pact is ironclad. It was written in blood and sealed with powers that predate human civilization. The only way to break it completely would require a sacrifice so profound that it would destroy everything our family has built and everyone who depends on it. Emma looked up at her mother, seeing not just fear and guilt but something else, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, her daughter would find the courage to make the choice that previous generations had been too selfish or too frightened to make. What if I'm willing to pay that price? Emma asked. What if I choose to destroy the Ashworth fortune, break the pact completely, and accept whatever consequences follow? Sarah's face went white. Emma, you don't understand what you're suggesting. It wouldn't just be our family that suffers. Thousands of people would lose their jobs overnight. Charitable organizations would collapse without our funding. Political candidates we've supported would find their campaigns bankrupt. The economic ripple effects would be temporary, Emma interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. Companies would find new investors, charities would seek new donors, politicians would find new backers. But Rebecca would grow up free, and no future Ashworth daughter would face this choice. The cycle would end with me. Sarah stared at her daughter in amazement and terror. You're talking about sacrificing everything, our wealth, our status, our comfort, our family's legacy. You would condemn us to poverty and disgrace for the sake of breaking a curse that has defined our bloodline for over 2 centuries. Emma stood up, brushing dust from her nightgown, and for the first time in days she felt like she could breathe clearly. Mom, I've spent my entire life benefiting from blood money without knowing it. Every advantage I've enjoyed, every door that opened for me, every opportunity that came my way, all of it was purchased with the lives of murdered girls. How can I accept that inheritance? How can I let it continue? The question hung in the air between them, and Emma could see her mother wrestling with 30 years of guilt and self-justification. Sarah had lived with the knowledge of what her comfort cost, had built a life on the foundation of her sister's sacrifice, and had convinced herself it was the only way to survive. If you break the pact, Sarah said finally, we lose everything, but you and Rebecca both live. If you fulfill it, you die, but the prosperity continues for another generation, at least until Rebecca turns 16. Emma walked to her window and looked out at the neighborhood where she had grown up, manicured lawns, expensive cars, houses that spoke of comfort and security. All of it built on the same foundation as her family's wealth, the assumption that some people's lives were worth more than others, that privilege could be maintained through any means necessary. 14 days, Emma said, watching her neighbors begin their morning routines, unaware that their world might be about to change. I have 14 days to decide whether to die for blood money or live for something better. Behind her, Sarah began to cry, not the tears of fear she had shed earlier, but the deeper, more complex tears of a mother who was finally proud of her daughter and terrified of what that pride might cost them both. Would you accept a fortune built on the deaths of innocent girls, or would you choose to break a centuries-old curse knowing it would destroy everything your family had built? What price would you be willing to pay for the freedom of future generations? Emma spent the next 3 days in the town library, surrounded by stacks of books on New England folklore, colonial history, and occult practices. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had given up asking what a 16-year-old girl needed with grimoires and treatises on supernatural contracts. Emma's intensity and the dark circles under her eyes suggested someone who wouldn't be deterred by questions about appropriate research topics. On the 4th day, Emma found what she was looking for buried in a leather-bound journal donated by a local historian's estate. The author, Jeremiah Whitmore, had documented several encounters with supernatural entities in 18th-century Massachusetts, including a detailed account of a contract similar to the Ashworth Pact. According to Whitmore's research, such contracts could be severed through a ritual of substitution, but not the kind that Helen and Sarah had used to redirect the curse from one family member to another. This ritual required someone who had already passed their obligated age to willingly take the place of the intended victim, offering their remaining years in exchange for the pact's complete dissolution. Emma's hands trembled as she read Whitmore's description of the ceremony. The substitute had to be someone with blood connection to the original contract, and their sacrifice had to be made willingly, with full knowledge of what they were giving up. If successful, the entity would be banished permanently, and any supernatural benefits derived from the pact would be immediately revoked. The price of severing such bonds, Whitmore had written, is not merely death, but the complete erasure of all advantages gained through supernatural means. Wealth will vanish, influence will crumble, and the family name will carry shame rather than honor. Yet for those with courage enough to choose righteousness over comfort, such sacrifice may be the only path to redemption. Emma photographed every relevant page with her phone, then drove home to find her mother waiting in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and an expression of grim determination. "I know what you've been researching," Sarah said without preamble. "And I know what you're thinking. But Emma, I won't let you die for my sins. I've had 30 years to live with the consequences of my choices. It's time I paid the price myself." Emma sat down across from her mother, studying the woman who had raised her with such careful protection from the truth. "The ritual requires someone who's already past their 16th birthday. It has to be you, doesn't it?" Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should have done this years ago, the moment I realized what my survival had cost Margaret. But I was selfish and frightened, and I convinced myself that protecting you meant maintaining the status quo. I was wrong." Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hands. "If we do this, we lose everything. The house, the trust funds, all of it. We'll be left with nothing but whatever money isn't tied to supernatural influence. Which is approximately $3,000 in our checking account," Sarah said with a bitter laugh. "Everything else, the house, the investments, the business partnerships, all of it will crumble the moment the pact is broken. But Emma, we'll be free. You'll be free to live past 16, and Rebecca will never have to face this choice." Emma felt a mixture of terror and relief so intense it made her dizzy. Freedom had a price, but it was a price measured in material possessions rather than human lives. For the first time since finding that first portrait in Ashworth Manor, Emma felt hope. "When do we do it?" she asked. "Tonight. The ritual must be performed at the location where the original pact was made, and it requires specific materials that I've been gathering for years, hoping I'd eventually find the courage to use them." That evening, Emma and Sarah drove to Ashworth Manor in silence, the trunk of their car loaded with items that Sarah had collected during 3 decades of research: blessed salt from 7 different churches, iron nails salvaged from the manor's original construction, candles made from beeswax mixed with herbs that Whitmore had specified, and a locket containing hair from every Ashworth daughter who had died, including a strand that Margaret had preserved from their sister Helen. The manor looked different in the twilight, less imposing and more simply sad. Its broken windows and peeling paint seemed to reflect the weight of all the tragedy it had witnessed, and Emma could swear she heard whispers of encouragement from the portrait gallery as they entered. They found the entrance to the cellar behind a door that Emma had never noticed during her previous visits. Stone steps led down into darkness that seemed to swallow the beam of their flashlights, and the temperature dropped noticeably with each step they descended. The cellar was older than the manor itself, its stone walls bearing carvings that predated European settlement in the region. At its center stood an altar of black stone, its surface stained with centuries of offerings, its base inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. "This is where Elizabeth made the original pact," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the confined space. "And this is where we end it." Emma helped her mother arrange the ritual materials according to Whitmore's specifications. The blessed salt formed a protective circle around the altar, the iron nails were placed at the cardinal points, and the candles were lit in a specific sequence that cast dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. As Sarah began the incantation, the temperature in the cellar plummeted. Their breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and the candle flames began to flicker violently despite the absence of any wind. The entity arrived with the fury of something that had been cheated of its expected meal. It manifested not as the gaunt figure Emma had encountered in the cemetery, but as a writhing mass of shadow and teeth that pressed against the boundaries of their protective circle like flood water testing a dam. "You think to cheat me of what is owed," the creature's voice came from everywhere at once, resonating through the stone walls and vibrating in Emma's bones. "The pact was sealed in blood and witnessed by powers older than your comprehension. It cannot be broken by mortal will." Sarah's voice remained steady as she continued the ritual, though Emma could see sweat beading on her mother's forehead despite the Arctic cold. "I offer myself as substitute for the debt. My life for the dissolution of all contracts, my remaining years for the freedom of future generations." The entity's laughter was like breaking glass. "Your life. Woman, you have already lived beyond your allotted span. Your death would be payment for past debts, not future absolution. The girl's life is what was promised, and the girl's life is what I will claim." But Sarah was ready for this objection. From her purse, she withdrew a document that Emma recognized as a birth certificate, not Emma's, but Rebecca's. "2 daughters of this generation," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The contract specifies 1 daughter per generation, but it doesn't specify which daughter. I offer my life to break the pact entirely, freeing both girls from their inherited obligation." The entity paused, its writhing form suddenly still. Emma could feel it considering Sarah's offer, weighing the mathematics of supernatural debt and payment. "If I accept your substitution," the creature said slowly, "every advantage your bloodline has gained through our contract will be immediately revoked. Wealth will vanish, properties will be lost, influence will crumble. Your family name will become synonymous with failure and disgrace. Are you prepared for such consequences?" Sarah looked at Emma, and in her mother's eyes, Emma saw not fear but peace. "I am prepared to pay the price of redemption." The ritual circle began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the candles. Emma felt power building in the cellar, older and more fundamental than the entity they were facing, the power of willing sacrifice, of love that chose righteousness over comfort. But as Sarah spoke the final words of the severing ritual, something went wrong. The second entity that Margaret's failed attempt had awakened stirred in the foundations beneath them, and Emma realized with dawning horror that breaking the original pact would not banish both creatures, it would only free the second one from the constraints that had bound it for 30 years. The stone altar began to crack as something enormous pressed against it from below, and Emma understood that they were about to face not just the entity that held their family's contract, but the ravenous thing that had been feeding on Ashworth despair since Margaret's death. Sarah completed the ritual just as the cellar floor split open, and both creatures manifested at once, the original entity writhing in fury as it felt its contract dissolving, and the second creature rising from the depths with hunger that had been building for 3 decades. Emma watched her mother's body begin to age rapidly as the years she had borrowed from the pact caught up with her all at once. But Sarah was smiling as she crumbled to dust, her final words barely audible above the creature's screams of rage and hunger. "Run, Emma. The pact is broken, but the awakened one is free. You have to." The cellar collapsed around them as both entities fought for dominance over what remained of the Ashworth bloodline, and Emma found herself alone with forces that had been unleashed rather than banished. Emma crawled through the rubble of the collapsed cellar, her hands cut by sharp stones and her lungs burning from the dust that filled the air. Behind her, she could hear the two entities battling for supremacy, their inhuman shrieks echoing through the fractured foundation of Ashworth Manor as they fought over rights to her family's soul. The original pact was broken. Emma could feel its dissolution like a physical weight lifting from her chest. But Sarah's sacrifice had unleashed something far worse than what they had sought to banish. The creature that Margaret had accidentally awakened 30 years ago was no longer bound by the constraints of an existing contract, and its hunger had grown exponentially during its decades of imprisonment. Emma emerged from the cellar through a crack in the stone wall, finding herself in the manor's overgrown garden as the Victorian mansion collapsed behind her. Windows exploded outward in sequence, their glass catching moonlight like fallen stars. Support beams groaned and snapped as supernatural forces tore through the building's structure, seeking escape from their underground prison. But even as Ashworth Manor crumbled to ruins, Emma felt the immediate effects of the broken pact rippling outward like shock waves. Her phone buzzed with emergency notifications, automated messages from banks informing her that accounts had been frozen due to irregularities in asset verification. News alerts reported sudden crashes in several major corporations that she now realized had been built on supernatural foundations. The Ashworth family fortune was evaporating in real time, taking with it the livelihoods of thousands of people who had unknowingly depended on blood money for their survival. Emma ran toward her car, but the ground beneath her feet began to crack and heave as the awakened entity burst free from its subterranean prison. The creature that emerged was nothing like the gaunt figure she had met in the cemetery. This was something primordial and vast, a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. Where the original entity had worn the shape of a man, this thing was pure hunger given form, tentacles of shadow that reached toward her with mouths lined with teeth like broken mirrors. As Emma reached her car, she realized that the keys were still in the ruins of the manor, buried beneath tons of collapsed stone and timber. The awakened entity sensed her desperation and began to laugh, a sound like tearing metal that made her teeth ache in her skull. "Did you think breaking one contract would free you, little morsel?" the creature hissed, its voice coming from a dozen mouths at once. "I am not bound by your ancestors' bargain. I am bound by nothing but appetite, and I have been so very, very hungry." Emma backed away from the approaching nightmare, her mind racing through everything she had learned about her family's supernatural entanglements. The original entity had been constrained by rules, it could only claim what was owed according to specific terms. But this thing had no such limitations. It would devour her not because of any inherited debt, but simply because she was available prey. As the creature closed in, Emma felt something shift in the air around her. The temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath misting in the frigid night. But this cold felt different, protective rather than threatening, familiar rather than alien. The ghosts of the Ashworth daughters began to manifest around her, their spirits finally freed from the original pact by Sarah's sacrifice. Elizabeth, Catherine, Victoria, Mary, Margaret, all the girls who had died at 16 over the past 2 centuries stood between Emma and the ravenous entity, their forms glowing with ethereal light that pushed back the creature's encroaching darkness. "You have no claim on this child," Margaret's ghost spoke for all of them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years learning the true nature of the forces that had claimed her life. "The debt is paid, the contract is void, and the bloodline is free." But the awakened entity was not impressed by ghostly intervention. It lashed out with tendrils of pure darkness, passing through the spirits as though they were made of mist. "Phantoms and echoes," it sneered. "You have no power here beyond what sentiment grants you. The girl's flesh is warm, her life force is strong, and her fear makes her delicious. I will feast on her essence and then seek out the other daughter, the one called Rebecca, to complete my meal." Emma felt a surge of protective fury at the mention of her half-sister. Rebecca was barely a year old, innocent of the Ashworth family's crimes, unaware that her bloodline had marked her for supernatural predation. The idea of this creature hunting down a baby who couldn't even walk yet filled Emma with rage that burned brighter than her fear. "You want to feed on Ashworth blood?" Emma shouted, stepping forward instead of back. "Then feed on mine and leave Rebecca alone." The entity paused, surprised by her sudden aggression. In that moment of hesitation, Emma understood something crucial about the nature of supernatural predators. They fed not just on life force or fear, but on the despair of their victims, the crushing knowledge that death was inevitable and resistance was futile. But Emma wasn't despairing anymore. She was angry, and anger was something these creatures didn't know how to digest. The ghosts of her ancestors sensed the shift in Emma's emotional state and began to glow brighter, their forms becoming more solid. Margaret stepped forward, her spirit radiating the same fury that had driven her to attempt breaking the original pact. "I spent 3 decades trapped in that thing's shadow," Margaret said, pointing at the writhing entity. "Fed on my failure, my guilt, my regret over not being able to save future generations of our family. But Emma has done what I could not, she has broken the cycle willingly, accepting the loss of everything our bloodline built in exchange for freedom. That sacrifice has power, older and deeper than any contract signed with demons." The awakened entity began to shrink back as the ghostly Ashworth daughters formed a circle around Emma, their combined will creating a barrier of righteous purpose that the creature couldn't penetrate. But Emma realized that their protection was temporary, the ghosts were sustained by the energy released from breaking the pact, and that energy was already beginning to dissipate. "There's one more ritual," Margaret whispered urgently. "One final binding that can send this thing back to whatever hell spawned it. But it requires a living Ashworth to speak the words of banishment, and the cost." "What cost?" Emma demanded. Margaret's ghostly form flickered with uncertainty. "The creature must be given what it expects to receive, Ashworth blood spilled willingly. Not death, but enough life force to satisfy its hunger and convince it to return to dormancy. You would survive, but you would age rapidly, losing decades of your natural lifespan in exchange for its departure." Emma looked around at the spirits of her ancestors, seeing in their faces the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. 2 centuries of selfish decisions, of passing curses to younger sisters and accepting prosperity built on murder. The cycle had to end, and it had to end with someone willing to pay a real price for redemption. "Tell me the words," Emma said. As Margaret began to recite the banishment ritual, Emma pulled a shard of broken glass from the manor's wreckage and drew it across her palm. Blood welled up from the cut, and she let it drip onto the ground where the awakened entity had first emerged. The creature sensed the offering and began to approach, its hunger overcoming its caution. But as Emma spoke the words of banishment, Mixing her blood with the earth that had been tainted by decades of supernatural influence, she felt the thing's attention focusing not on her flesh but on her willingness to sacrifice for others. "I bind you with willing blood," Emma chanted, her voice growing stronger with each phrase. "I banish you with accepted loss. I send you to sleep with the understanding that some things are worth dying for, and some prices are worth paying. Return to darkness, return to waiting, return to the depths where hunger sleeps until the world forgets your name." The entity let out a shriek of frustrated rage as it felt itself being pulled back toward the earth. But this time its imprisonment would be different, sustained not by someone else's failed ritual, but by Emma's conscious choice to trade her future years for the safety of others. As the creature sank back into the broken ground, Emma felt decades of life force draining from her body. Her dark hair began to streak with silver, lines appeared around her eyes, and her young hands took on the texture of someone who had lived through hard experience. She aged 20 years in 20 seconds, but she remained alive, and more importantly, free. The ghosts of her ancestors began to fade as their purpose was fulfilled, but Margaret lingered long enough to whisper one final message. "The pact is broken, the creature is bound, and the bloodline is free. But Emma, the world is full of families like ours, bloodlines that have made similar bargains, children who will face similar choices. Your sacrifice has given you the knowledge to help them. Use it well." As dawn broke over the ruins of Ashworth Manor, Emma stood alone among the rubble, no longer 16 but no longer bound by inherited sins. The Ashworth fortune was gone, their social status had crumbled, and their name would be remembered as a cautionary tale rather than a symbol of success. But Rebecca would grow up free, and Emma would live to see her do it. 6 months after the destruction of Ashworth Manor, Emma Ashworth, now carrying the physical appearance of a 36-year-old woman despite being barely 17, served coffee and apple pie to a customer who didn't recognize the name on her name tag. The diner where she worked sat on the outskirts of Portland, Maine, close enough to keep an eye on her half-sister Rebecca but far enough from Massachusetts to escape the worst of the scandal that had consumed her family name. The news media had called it the most spectacular financial collapse in New England history. Overnight, the Ashworth family fortune had simply vanished, bank accounts zeroed out, property deeds became invalid, business partnerships dissolved without explanation. The ripple effects had been exactly as devastating as Sarah had predicted: thousands of employees laid off from companies that suddenly couldn't make payroll, charitable organizations scrambling to replace funding that had disappeared, political candidates finding themselves bankrupt in the middle of election campaigns. Emma had watched the coverage from a motel room in Maine, her prematurely aged face reflecting the weight of responsibility she now carried. But beneath the guilt and sorrow, she felt something she had never experienced before, the peace that came with earning her existence honestly, without supernatural assistance or inherited advantages. The apartment she rented above a used bookstore was barely 300 square feet, furnished with thrift store finds and lit by lamps that required quarters for the electricity meter. It was the first space she had ever lived in that belonged entirely to her, purchased with money she had earned through her own labor rather than the deaths of 16-year-old girls. Emma had chosen Portland specifically because Rebecca lived there, though she maintained careful distance from her half-sister and her unknowing mother. Once a week, she would visit the playground where Rebecca toddled about under her mother's watchful eye, confirming that the child was healthy, happy, and free from any supernatural influences. Rebecca was growing up normal, no early manifestations of unusual luck, no signs of inherited advantages, no indication that her Ashworth blood carried any power beyond the genetic lottery of green eyes and strong bones. The work Emma had found helping other families with supernatural entanglements had started by accident. A customer at the diner had mentioned strange occurrences in her family's history, a pattern of early deaths among the women, unusual prosperity following tragic losses, dreams of figures that beckoned from family graveyards. Emma had recognized the signs immediately and offered to help research the woman's genealogy. What they discovered was a pact nearly identical to the Ashworth contract, made by a desperate ancestor in the early 1800s and sustained by generations of women who had accepted the benefits without questioning their cost. Unlike Emma, however, this family was not willing to sacrifice their supernatural advantages for freedom. When presented with evidence of their inherited guilt and given the choice between wealth and conscience, they had chosen to maintain the status quo. Emma had learned that not every family could be saved, not every bloodline was ready for redemption, and not every curse could be broken by those who benefited from it most. Some people preferred comfortable chains to the uncertainties of freedom. But others were different. Through word of mouth and careful networking, Emma had connected with families across New England who carried similar burdens, generational contracts that traded human lives for material prosperity, ancestral debts that passed from parent to child like hereditary diseases, supernatural entanglements that grew stronger with each generation that chose convenience over conscience. The Whitmore family of Vermont had made a pact that guaranteed their crops would never fail in exchange for the life of their eldest son every 25 years. The Blackwood sisters of New Hampshire had inherited a contract that provided them with unusual artistic talent at the cost of their sanity, each generation producing brilliant painters who died in madness before their 40th birthdays. The Crane bloodline of Connecticut had purchased political influence through a bargain that required them to sacrifice their capacity for love, producing successful politicians who left behind trails of broken families and destroyed relationships. Each family required a different approach, different research, different rituals of liberation. Some could be freed through substitution and sacrifice, others through the systematic dismantling of the advantages their contracts provided. A few required more extreme measures, entire bloodlines choosing to end their genetic lines rather than pass their curses to future generations. Emma's work was dangerous, often heartbreaking, and always underpaid. She had been attacked by entities whose contracts she had threatened, cursed by family members who preferred their gilded cages to uncertain freedom, and nearly killed by rituals that demanded more life force than she could safely provide. The supernatural aging she had undergone during the final confrontation at Ashworth Manor had left her with limited life expectancy. She estimated she had perhaps 30 years remaining instead of the 60 she might have lived naturally. But those 30 years felt more valuable than any fortune she had inherited. They were years she had chosen, years she had earned, years that belonged to her rather than to the memory of murdered ancestors. On quiet nights in her small apartment, Emma would sometimes dream of the portrait gallery at Ashworth Manor. But now the paintings showed her ancestors as they might have been, women who had lived full lives, who had grown old naturally, who had died surrounded by children and grandchildren who remembered them with love rather than fear. In her dreams, Margaret would visit her and they would discuss the families Emma was helping, sharing strategies and warnings about particularly dangerous supernatural contracts. Emma never married or had romantic relationships, not from fear of passing on cursed blood, but from a deep understanding that some callings required complete dedication. Her life was full in ways that had nothing to do with romantic love, full of purpose, full of meaningful work, full of the satisfaction that came from helping others escape prisons built by their ancestors' desperation. The scars on her palm where she had cut herself during the banishment rituals served as daily reminders of the price she had paid for freedom. But they also reminded her that some prices were worth paying, that some sacrifices created value rather than destroying it, and that choosing to break cycles of inherited harm was always better than perpetuating them for comfort's sake. Rebecca grew from a toddler to a young child during Emma's years in Portland, her development marked by all the normal milestones of childhood without any supernatural interference. She was bright, curious, and loved, everything that Emma and her ancestors had been denied by the weight of their family's dark legacy. Watching Rebecca play with other children, attending normal school, forming natural friendships, Emma felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with material success and everything to do with having chosen correctly when the choice mattered most. Emma's final dream, which came to her on a cold February night in her 37th year of life, showed her a gathering of all the families she had helped free from supernatural contracts. Hundreds of people, children, parents, grandparents, living normal lives unburdened by inherited guilt or supernatural obligation. At the center of the gathering stood a woman with silver hair and green eyes, no longer young but radiant with the peace that came from a life lived according to conscience rather than convenience. Emma woke from that dream knowing it was time. Her work was nearly finished, her remaining life force almost depleted by years of ritual sacrifice and supernatural confrontation. But she had accomplished what she had set out to do, breaking not just her own family's curse, but serving as a catalyst for others to break theirs as well. Her final letter, found on her desk the morning after she died peacefully in her sleep, was addressed to Rebecca Collins, now 8 years old and still unaware of her connection to the Ashworth bloodline. My dear sister, the letter began, by the time you are old enough to understand these words, you will be free to choose your own path in life. No supernatural contracts bind your future, no inherited debts will come due on your birthday, no entity waits in the shadows to claim what previous generations promised in their desperation. The price of that freedom was paid willingly by those who came before you, and the gift we leave you is the chance to build your life on a foundation of your own choices rather than inherited advantages or inherited curses. Live well, love freely, and remember that the greatest wealth is the knowledge that you owe nothing to forces that would trade temporary comfort for permanent bondage. The chain is finally broken. If you've stayed with this story to the end and understand that some inheritances are too dark to keep, comment, the chain is finally broken.